morning. Can you hear me? The green light is on. Good morning. Okay, so you can hear me. People are in a happy mood today. Okay, good morning. So we are continuing our study, of course, on the songs that we sing. Excuse me. This week we're going to take a look at a couple of passages that we hear this phrase a lot: psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So we're going to take a look at a couple of passages, the two that use that. As you can see, the reference there is Colossians 3:16 and Ephesians 5:19. We will read those, but I don't have enough screens to show you that and also show some questions and items at the same time. So if you've got electronic or paper, a Bible where you can keep those handy might be useful. So the first one, just going to read these. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. The next one, let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Very, very similar in word choice. Of course, both were written by Paul. There are some overlapping themes in the two books, so it's not surprising that he would, bring up the same topic, certainly. The emphasis, if you do, dig a little deeper, the emphasis on Colossians and Ephesians are a little different. But nevertheless, he did write both of them, have some similar messages, so it's not surprising that he would use this same language. To look at it a little bit more in context. So from Colossians 3, backing up a verse, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. Then back to Ephesians, we'll throw in some extra context. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God, even the Father, and be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. Okay, so once you broaden it a little bit, it's not quite word for word like that phrase was, but you do see some themes in these two passages that repeat over both books. So I want to look at some of those, and we'll dig deeper and deeper as we go along. So the first set of themes. There are several things that carry this concept of be filled. So last week I did a lot of talking and lecturing about the science behind music and songs. This week I want to remedy that and give you all lots of chance to talk because I think it goes much better. So what things do you see? This is where you can flip back, it helps. What things do you see in these passages that carry the idea of being filled? Mm-hmm. What else? Right. Be filled with the Spirit. So you're saying, don't be filled with this earthly thing. Be filled with the Spirit. You said be filled. You said love of Christ. There are a couple of other things there. Yes, that's what I was looking for. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you. And then let the peace of Christ, and this is New American Standard, is let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. So those are three that they have some overlap. They're not all exactly the same. But one of those to really look at is let the word of Christ richly dwell within you. Because we're talking about words. We're talking about these songs that have words. So, where are you going to get these words? We're hopefully the things that we are singing are related to the word of Christ, or the words that God gives us. And again, we're going to dig deeper as we go. It's interesting to me that when you look at these parallel passages, you have be filled with the Spirit, and then let the peace of Christ be in your hearts. So, it's almost as if the Word is dwelling in you, then you have these other things. How do I get this Spirit? How do I have peace in Christ? Well, a lot of it is going to be letting His Word dwell in us. Another set of themes have to do with your heart. What heart themes do we have here? Giving thanks, absolutely. What other lines are related to heart? It's going to be the big obvious one here. Joy. Making melody in your heart. Yes, we're definitely going there. Somebody. So we've got, making melody, and we're talking about songs. So what's the first part of that line? Come on, say it here. There you go. Thank you. I heard some voices now. I know. It's a rainy day. It's kind of dreary. Tracy? Yes, they are speaking. And that's our next slide. So you're jumping ahead. That's okay. So with our hearts, we're singing and making melody. How do you sing in your heart? Let me back up. What is your heart? I'm going to have to come back here a little bit. What'd you say? What is your heart? It's your mind. There are various places in the New Testament that mention your heart. And in the Bible, it has this connotation of, your spirit, your soul. Go ahead.
Mind, conscience,
will, emotion. Good. So how would you sing with your heart? Physically, we sing with our mouths. How do we sing with our hearts? Our attitude. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
like the mind with the logical side and the heart with the more emotional side.
Right.
I don't know if that's exactly what the verse is doesn't want, the Bible isn't asking us to just sing the words, hopefully get tune right, that type of thing. It's asking us to put our feelings in our
Very good. That's pretty much where I wanted to go. Let me recap this for some who might not have heard. Dave was saying that the heart is more akin to emotion in the Bible as opposed to your mind is, the mental, the knowledge, and that God's asking us to put our emotion into it and the spirit. Go ahead.
There's a way to say I love you to somebody, be your spouse or mother, and not say with your heart, and that's usually picked up by the person you're saying it to. Whereas if you say with your heart, it means a lot more to the person you're saying it to.
That's very good. You can say things without your heart, even things that have a message that should be very heartfelt, like I love you, I care for you. The way you say it can give you an indication of whether it's sincere or not. So, are you putting your heart into it? That's another phrase that you hear about. Somebody's doing something, but they're not putting their heart into it. So that's their will. We said earlier, what you really want. What is that? Are you putting your heart into it? Mm-hmm.
Matthew 12 talks about how can evil speak what is good, for the mouth speaks out of that which the heart fills the heart, and every careless word that people speak you give an account for. So out of the heart is what you're speaking. So that kind of gives you the indication that what's in your heart is going to.
Out of your heart is where you speak. It makes me think of the passage, which was a debate about what you eat, but it's what goes in and what comes out was that discussion. So if we go back to our previous theme, if Jesus, if His love is, if His grace is, and if His word is in our hearts, then these things are going to be coming out. So it's that other passage, said it's not what goes into the body that defiles it, but what comes out of it. Well, are you singing with your heart? So if we, bearing all that in mind about how we've defined heart, what does this passage say to do with our hearts? We've mentioned some of it. We said singing, making melody, and we said thankfulness. All three of these wrapped together. It's worth a special mention on thankfulness. If you read that Colossians passage, it's in our 3:16 verse, but if you look at that broader context, it's in verse 15, it's in verse 17. So we have bookended this passage about singing. I may just go back to that one. Here we go. So let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts and be thankful. Then with all, singing with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts. And then whatever you do, do it in the name of Jesus, giving thanks through Him to God the Father. So again, it goes back to this, what's in your heart. If you have a mindset of thankfulness, then what's coming out of your heart in our singing is going to be potentially very different. Back to this section. So we talked a little bit about singing with heart versus mouth, voice. What does it mean? If you're singing with your heart, what's it going to sound like? How about this one? I don't have it on the slide. Make a what kind of noise? Joyful noise, yes. Make a joyful noise. This is No, I can't say that. That's on the next slide. We'll get there. It's time to move on. Okay, so now we get to another theme. It's my last point is where that statement I almost made is. So now we're talking about things we do with one another. What are we doing with one another?
You look at verse 19 and 21 as the bookends to everything that's in the middle, right?
Mm-hmm.
That puts context to what's in the middle. And I look at it as the middle part, verse 20, tells us the what. Verse 19 and 21 tells us the why, right? This idea of singing and making melody in our heart for the purpose of addressing one another.
Right.
So that we can encourage each other, and in doing so, we submit to each other.
Mm-hmm. 5:19 there. I think we already said that. That's, we are talking to one another. We are speaking to each other. And what does that do? Yes. All right. So there are our three words. We've hit them now. We are speaking to one another, we are teaching one another, and we are admonishing one another. How are these words similar and different? Throw some things out. How are they similar? That's the easy part. They're all vocal. Yes, the obvious. Different intent. Very good. So to me, speaking is pretty generic. We are speaking to one another. It's those other two that I think really start getting into the intent, and that's what you were saying earlier. So as we sing these songs to one another, we are to be teaching and admonishing. What's the difference between teaching and admonishing? Go ahead.
I was just going to say they're all a form of communication.
Yes, they're all communication. We're trying to give this message. What is our message trying to tell? Tracy?
Teach a concept to someone, but admonishing them is encouraging them in that concept as far as, I can teach somebody 1 + 1 = 2, but I can sit next to them and say, oh, but here's another way of looking at 1 + 1 = 2, and encourage them as they learn that lesson. So I think they go together, but you can teach something and then walk away and not give any encouragement. And a lot of our songs actually have lessons in them.
Right.
About biblical concepts. And then a lot of our songs are also encouraging people to fight the fight and stay in faith and to be filled, let the word of Christ dwell richly in you.
So we can teach one another with the things we say, and we can admonish, encourage, spur someone on. Okay, so as Tracy was saying, here is this message, here is, this lesson, but now go live it. A little bit later, the second half of the lesson, the song we're talking about, the author wrote it, and I'll just mention this. He wrote it in a time of sorrow. He had experienced a loss. So this song it's a song of encouragement. So you say that, during these times, rely on God. Jesus is there. So with the same kind of thing, we could have a fantastic sermon and follow it up with, a song that's going to encourage us to go out and live it. We have this way to encourage each other. I'll give a personal example. I spent a few days this week out of town visiting my mother. She's a little older. She's been very cautious in exposure to COVID. And somebody had given her a CD with some sermons on it. And we were listening to that while I was there. And after the sermon, there was some singing. And not to, I don't say this to be critical. It was a smaller group. The recording was not very, it was not a perfectly done recording. So it didn't necessarily sound beautiful, right? In terms of, listen to the harmonies and our four parts and all this. But, she looked at me and she said, it sounds so good to hear the singing. That's that admonishing. That's the encouragement that we can get from hearing these songs. We've talked a lot in the last couple of weeks about what music does, what a song does as opposed to just saying something. And we talked about how it touches the emotions, how it clicks in your brain and it makes you remember things. Sometimes you don't want to remember it. You got, jingle from a commercial on the radio and you go the rest of the day and that jingle is in your head. These things stick with us, and we've talked about that a lot over the last couple of weeks. So we can do the same thing with the words of Christ. Let the words of Christ dwell in you richly, and then let it come out and teach and admonish one another so that hopefully when we leave here, we're singing that song, that song of encouragement. The next theme, both passages say that we are, speaking to one another, but what's the second direction this goes? Ephesians 5, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. Colossians 3, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. So we've got a dual purpose here. We've got the part that touches us. We've got teaching and admonishing, encouraging one another, but at the same time, we are worshiping God. How we interact with each other does a lot for, or says a lot about how we're interacting with God. Go ahead, Matt.
Saying earlier, 1 Corinthians 14:15 says, "What is the outcome then? I shall pray with the Spirit, and I shall pray with the mind also. I shall sing with the Spirit, and I shall sing with the mind also." So
Very good.
I think it just reinforces what you were saying earlier.
Right. 1 Corinthians 14, 15. Oh, 1 Corinthians 14:15. Talking about praying with, say it again for me.
I shall pray with the Spirit, and I shall pray with the mind. Also, I shall sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the mind also.
All right, thank you. So it says, I will pray with the Spirit and with the mind, and I will sing with the Spirit and with the mind. So, in the same way that our prayers have a spiritual side and a verbal side, a mental acknowledgement, our songs have that same connection. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And I am neither a Greek nor a Hebrew scholar, so I wanted to hit this a little bit because people frequently bring out, and take those three words and compare them. So I didn't want to get by without mentioning these. So there are three words, obviously. The first one is Psalms. It's from the Greek psalmos. Who knows how you pronounce it? It goes back to the book of Psalms, exactly where you would think it would. And of course, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Old Testament temple worship, there were instruments involved. So this book of songs, which is what Psalms essentially was, came to be known by, this word that referred to a piece of music that was normally accompanied by musical instruments. And in particular, if somebody said, in the New Testament times, if they said Psalms, they would understand it just like we would. It's that book of 150 or so Psalms that we associate with the book of David. And we're going to do a lesson on Psalms later. So there's that word. Then there's the word hymns. Hymnos, hymnos, again, pronunciation beyond me. The definition or the idea here is praise or acknowledgement of greatness. I was surprised to find out that in early Greek that a hymn did not necessarily have a spiritual meaning, but it was a hymn of praise. It might be a praise of a hero that was in their, I guess what we would call popular culture of the time. So we have the Psalms, which would have been associated with the book of Psalms and considered inspired. And there were songs of praise, and they would have been referred to as hymns. And then the third is spiritual songs, pneumatikos ode. Note the similarity to the word ode, kind of a generic word for song. So therefore it required the extra pneumatikos is spiritual, and it's used in various places in the New Testament, talking about either the spirit or a spiritual or the breath, more of an intangible meaning. So that differentiates it from a non-spiritual song. A lot of people look at these and they say, well, Paul said to sing with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So we've got three categories of songs. And they look at them like this. We have psalms, and we have hymns, and we have spiritual songs, and we can sing this one or we can sing that one. I will, let you make your own judgment, but let you know that there is a debate on this one. If you go back and look at where did those words, when Paul used them, what would people have thought of? Well, they all came from and were used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, that would have been in popular usage then. All three of those Greek words were used in that Greek set of Psalms. In the Hebrew, there were words like mizmor, which was generally translated into the Greek psalmos, which again was a poem set to music. Hebrew's word for praise was tehillah, and it was generally translated as hymnos. And then the generic word in Hebrew for song was shir, and that was most often translated ode. When you look at the titles to the Psalms, all three words were used. In some Psalms, it might say Psalmos, translated from Mizmor, and in some other Psalms, and if anybody's interested, I could point you to the source that lists which Psalms are which. But some of them have hymnos from Tehillah, some have shir, some have more than one, some say a psalm and a song, as in psalmos and ode are both in the title. So because of this somewhat ambiguity, and just for the record, the Septuagint translation called that collection of songs Psalms, but the Hebrew title for the book was actually the praise version, or Tehillah. So I say all that to come back that there is a debate on, we have psalms and we have hymns and spiritual songs, and those are different categories. Some people say that because those were all kind of jumbled together already in the Septuagint translation that the people Paul is writing to would have been familiar with, they lump them all together. Some will say, oh, Paul's just, using these same three words like you would have used if you were reading the Psalms. As a matter of fact, some say that there's no distinction, and when Paul is telling us to sing psalms, those are the only things we should sing. So you can go, just this wide extreme of, we should sing psalms, and this refers only to psalms, or we've got a whole bunch of different things. I tend to think, and again, take this however you want, I think we have Psalms. There's no doubt that is referring to the book of Psalms and the songs that were written in there. Then there's another category called hymns. By the way, I forgot to mention some of the other usage of hymns in the New Testament. Jesus and his disciples after the Passover, it says, when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. After the Passover, traditionally the Jews would have sung one of the Psalms. So that reference after they sang a hymn quite possibly was a psalm. Because of things like that, I look at it like this. You have this category of hymns, and those are songs of praise or worship, and that includes the Psalms, also includes other songs. And as a matter of fact, just a few verses earlier in Ephesians, there is in many translations, depending on which one you're reading, it's written like a poem. It's written in verse. So there are things that are characteristic of language that indicate poetry or song. And you recognize, some of this in English. We like to rhyme. We like iambic pentameter, so you da 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 with that rhythm to it. Don't ask me what the Greek and the Hebrew things that indicated a verse or a poem is, but there's enough of an indication that several places in the Bible are either poetry or songs. So I tend to think, because of the way this is used, that we have these hymns that are songs of praise, and that includes the Psalms, but maybe not necessarily always be psalms. And in the same way, you have spiritual songs that would encompass the psalms and the hymns, but would be somewhat broader. So I just wanted to throw that out. I think sometimes you might hear people really focused on this one line, psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. The more important message to me is that whole context. We've got a relationship. We should be filled with Jesus, with the Spirit. We should be filled with His Word. We should have this relationship with each other in which we are teaching and encouraging one another, and ultimately this is all to worship God. So if you look at that entire passage, I look at it, this is the way I interpret that phrase, but I look at it as the whole context is meant to worship God. Matt.
We have different songs in our songbook for different reasons. We have songs like Hallelujah, Praise Jehovah, which is direct praise to God, but many of our invitation songs are directed toward each other. Like, have you been to Jesus, or are you washed in blood? We're talking to each other about that. So maybe there's different categories for those.
Absolutely. So the comment was, even in our songbooks, there are songs that, and some songbooks have headings. It will have, this section is for invitation, this section is for something else. So ourselves, we sing some songs that are very worshipful, that are very praiseful, and we sing some songs that are more directed to one another, to admonish maybe someone, as Matt said, during an invitation. admonish them, to examine themselves, and if they need prayer, to ask for it. So it goes back to intent we mentioned earlier. These different types of songs have different purposes, but they're all good. They're all in how we relate to each other and to God. Okay, I think we're going to be right about on time. So this week's song, He Keeps Me Singing, I think it is, should have put this on here. I think it's 6:15 in the book if you want to read along. Yeah, 6:15. I use this one. It's kind of a no-brainer, honestly, as far as which song. We've had our discussion today of singing and making melody in your heart. Well, what's our first line here? There's within my heart a melody. So the writer, I mentioned earlier, had experienced a loss. He had lost his family, and I won't go into the story. But during this, very dark time of sadness, he wrote this song. And we've got 3 verses that are in our book. I found 5 verses elsewhere. There's one allusion in the 3 verses we have, and the other verses that are not in our book also talk about struggles a little bit. And for struggles, he keeps coming back to Jesus. So there's within my heart a melody. Again, that's almost it's not word for word, but man, the idea is straight from what we've said today. It jumps around a little bit. Fear not, peace be still. This comes from what? Jesus said it. He said it in the middle of the storm. That's right. He was talking to the wind and the sea. So peace be still. I'm with you in all of life's ebb and flow, which goes back to a sea type context. With tides and waves. So here he's drawing on this the story that we have of the disciples in the boat, and there's a storm and they're worried, and he calms the seas. So he's talking about comfort. Second verse. Feasting on the riches of his grace, resting neath his sheltering wing. I didn't even bother to count the number of times in the Old Testament there's a reference to taking shelter under the wing of God. There are numerous psalms and other passages. So over and over, this is an idea of refuge or protection, and we should go to God for that refuge. The third verse, a lot of our songs that we sing, sometimes very dramatically and literally, sometimes just kind of touch on the pictures that we get, and they're fairly limited in the Bible, of Jesus' ascension and coming back. So the ascension is described in Acts 1. There's some discussion of it in Thessalonians about his return. But here, so soon he's coming back to welcome me, and from beyond the sky. So, we have no real concept of heaven and where it is. But the easy thing to think of is, you have the sky, and then above it, Paul even talks about the third heaven in one point. So, heaven is considered above. So, he's coming back from beyond the sky. And then I shall wing my flight. I'm going to go with him and be in heaven. And there's 2 Timothy chapter 2 even says that, if you endure, you will reign with him. So there are numerous scriptural references in this song. I think we just about have time. All right. There's within my heart a melody, Jesus whispers sweet and low. Fear not, I am with thee, peace be still, in all of life's ebb and flow. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go, feasting on the riches of His grace, resting beneath the sheltering wing, always looking on His smiling face. That is why I shout and sing. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Soon He's coming back to welcome me, far beyond the starry sky. I shall wing my flight to worlds unknown. I shall reign with Him on high. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. All right, thank you. By the way, if anybody has suggestions for songs, we've got several weeks left to go. Don't tell me because I'll forget, but send me a note or a text or something that I can see and look at. But I would certainly be open to suggestions. All right, thank you.